going to talk a little bit about cigar box guitar necks. Um, the way we do our cigar box guitar necks, we do an applied fingerboard onto another piece of wood for our neck. We do a scarf joint, which is basically an angled headstock. We cut an angle on the end of our neck and an angle on our headstock piece, and then glue them together, and then the fingerboard makes up basically like a three-piece neck. I'm going to show you all the steps involved in making the headstock, making the scarf joint cut, and gluing on the fingerboard. Now, all the guitar necks we do are a through body, which means this piece of wood goes all the way through to the back of the cigar box. Gives it a lot of strength, as well as good sustain and tone. So stay tuned. What we're going to do is I'm going to get the pieces together and show you the components of the cigar box guitar neck and how I put them together. Alright, again, we're going to talk about cutting the scarf joint to get the angle on the cigar box guitar neck. Now, you can see that the neck itself, even though with the finish and sanding it looks like one piece, there's actually an angled joint right here. Now, the way in which we get that joint is we have a jig that I made up for the table saw that cuts it at a particular angle. Now, I've made my jig so that it's a fixed jig. I always cut the same angle, which I believe is about 15 degrees. You can make a jig that will cut it on a variable angle. I still have a jig that works on that same principle. And basically, with this one, you can loosen the screw and you can change the angle to get a different angled headstock. Now, what we're going to do is I'm going to show you how to cut both the headstock and the neck piece, and then basically once these two pieces are cut at their angles, what we do is we glue them on like this, and that gives us our angled headstock. First thing we're going to do is we're going to cut the neck piece so that it has its angle, and then we'll cut the headstock piece. As soon as I have the saw set up, I will show you that step. Okay, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to cut the angled piece that goes on the end of our neck. Now, to get this angle, again, what we're going to do is we're going to put a piece of wood into our scarf joint jig and clamp it in. Again, I believe the angle on this, it's either 13 or 15 degrees. You can really set it at whatever you want. But basically the way this works is this holds the piece of wood at a set angle, and then as it passes across the saw blade, it cuts that angle on there real nice. Now I'm going to cut this angle, and then I'll show you the headstock. Got our nice angle cut on there. So what we're going to do now is we're going to cut the headstock. Now again, the headstock cuts in basically the same way. We need this to go together like that. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our headstock piece. Now, I generally pre-cut this to about 3 1/8 inch wide and about 5/8 to 11/16 in thickness. So what we do is just the same thing with the neck. We just clamp our piece into the jig. And then once it's in the jig, neck out of the way, we just run it through the saw. Notice that the piece I cut didn't fall off the end. That's because my saw blade will only go so wide. So what I end up doing is I just go over to the bandsaw and I cut this little piece off. You could actually break it off because you're gonna end up, once it's glued onto the neck, shaping the headstock from there. I'll show you how to shape the headstock next. Alright, well, I showed you how to cut the angle on the neck piece, and I showed you we've cut the angle on our headstock piece. Now before we glue this on, I find it a lot easier to shape my headstock before it's glued on. So what I do is I take, and I've made myself some templates of a couple of different headstocks. I've reshaped a Gibson style headstock down a little bit for cigar box guitar, and same thing for the Fender. Nice thing with the Fender one is if I want to get crazy and do, like, you know, the Jimi Hendrix, or, you know, people that put a left-handed neck on a right-handed guitar or vice versa, all I got to do is just flip my template and I've got it. So just for the sake of fun, let's make this guitar a lefty style. We'll make it sort of like a Hendrixy kind of thing. So what I do is I just take and add my template, put it on top of my headstock piece, and once it's on there, just simply trace it. If you're going to build more than one guitar, or more than a few of them, making a template's a nice, easy way to get a fairly consistent result by having kind of the same thing over and over again. Once I've got my headstock shape drawn on, then I will usually continue down my scarf joint so I know where I can waste off the material. There you go. We'll have our headstock shape ready to go. We'll cut that out on the scroll saw next, and then our headstock will be ready to glue onto the neck. Okay, a lot of what we're going to do with our headstock we can do on the scroll saw. So we'll rough cut it, and then we can fine sand it a little bit later on. cut these, I always try and stick just a little outside of my line. It's a lot easier to go back and sand some of that off later than it is to try and add it back on. So, and especially up here on the neck, because it's a lot easier to have a little excess up here for when I glue that together than to be shy. So I leave that just a little bit wide, and when I straighten my neck out a little bit with sanding, I can clean that up. So next thing we're going to do is we're going to take and go to the drill press and clean up a little bit of this with a drum sander. One of the easiest ways to get your headstock in order is with some little sanding drums. I find it's a lot easier to do a little bit of this sanding now before I glue the headstock on than it is later. So we're going to do a little quick sanding on this and try and straighten it out just a touch. One other thing I'll mention to you while we're here at the sanding, doing the sanding, is when I laid out my templates, one thing that I did that was kind of handy was I took and kind of matched the curve on my template to the particular sanding drum, so that it just made it real handy to clean it up to that radius when I was doing my sanding. Another little tip I'll show you is to get a nice flat edge over here if you don't have, excuse me, one of the big belt sanders. One thing that we did, and I think you might find this interesting, if you got an old belt sander that you don't use much anymore, we took and mounted one upside down and put a regular power switch on it, and it works really good for truing up edges. So what we do with it is we just use it that on there, and you get yourself a nice straight edge and cleans it up. You can pick up the old belt sanders at yard sales pretty cheap, and it makes for a inexpensive tool. Before I glue my headstock on, I'm going to go ahead and drill my holes in the headstock, because again, it's a lot easier to drill that while I have a piece that I can lay on there flat versus a long neck hanging off of there. The tuning pegs I use require a stepped hole. Part of that is because it uses an escutcheon. And so you need two different holes. You need a 5/16 hole for the escutcheon itself to set down in, and then a 1/4 inch all the way through for your tuning peg. So the first hole we're going to drill is going to be our 5/16. Now this hole only needs to go down in about, I do it by eye, but that's probably about between a 1/4 and 3/8 of an inch. If you wanted to be precise, you could set a depth gauge and everything, but it's really kind of a moot point. As long as it's deep enough for the escutcheon, you're in good shape. So I've drilled the escutcheon, the holes for the escutcheon in there. Now I'm going to switch drill bits, and we will drill the through hole for the tuning peg. Let's add another block of wood in here. There we go. That's a little better. Alright, now our headstock's basically done other than some final sanding. We've got our two-step hole for our escutcheon. Tuning peg will go right down in through there. Oh, and we'll be ready to go when it's time. Okay, next thing we're going to do to get our neck into one piece here, we're just basically going to glue it on, which is a very simple process. All we need is a little glue and line it up and clamp it on, and we'll be ready to go. I typically prefer to use just standard old Titebond wood glue. Titebond 2 is what I typically use. It's good stuff. I've never had any problems with neck joints coming apart or anything like that. Should have cleaned out the tip of my glue bottle first, I guess. There we go. Okay, and just need to get some on there. Try and spread it around a little bit to make sure I have good even coverage, and then give it just a second to set. Wipe the glue off my fingers so I don't get it all over the place. But then all you got to do is just put your neck, or I'm sorry, your headstock on there. Kind of flush it up, and then I typically will use 3 clamps, 2 right up here at the top of the joint, and then I'll put 1 more on the back down here, and just let it set overnight, and then you can clean it up when it's done. You'll be good to go. I'm going to talk just a minute about where our neck goes through the box. Now you notice the neck gets thicker back here. Typically what we do is we add a second block of wood underneath there, 1 for strength, but 2 just to give it that heel like you'd have with many standard guitars. The way I accomplish that is very simple. I just take and cut another block of wood. You can use the same wood. On this particular neck, for some reason I decided I'm going to use a piece of mahogany. I like the contrast of woods, but I've cut the piece of wood so that it's the same depth. Now to help me out down the road, to get that curve in there, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take and just basically kind of pre-cut a little bit of that on there at the bandsaw. So I'll set that up here real quick, not to be too dizzy there. Come over here to the bandsaw, and basically what I do at this point is, and I just freehand this. You could start with a template of some sort. I just kind of pre-cut that radius in there a little bit, and then another handy use of our little belt sander is I can use the roundness of the belt sander to kind of clean that up. There, I've got my heel basically pre-shaped. All I've got to do now is just glue it onto my neck. So we're going to take and I'll flip you back around there. This is really very simple. Just add some glue to our bottom block. Again, Spread it around, the glue around just a little bit to make sure we got a good even coating. Don't want any spots left without any glue on here. Now, there's some set dimensions. You typically have so many inches from the front of your box to the back of your box, and this dimension here, it'll vary some, but if I glue my block on with about 14 and a half, 15 inches from where my scarf joint starts to here, I'll be in good shape. And just put a little pencil mark at about 15 inches. Line our block up to that. Here all we got to do is just a couple of clamps. Let's grab a couple more clamps. One thing's for certain, when it comes to building guitars, you can never have too many clamps. I hate to guesstimate, but I probably have somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 or 50 of these types of clamps. And the little spring clamps, like I used on the other end of the neck, I've probably got 200 or 300 of those, simply because you never can have enough clamps. If you're going to build more than one guitar, if you're going to build these in any kind of volume especially, you'll find that you will use lots and lots and lots and lots of clamps. Okay, outside of my fingerboard and shaping, my neck is better than halfway done. Lots of sanding and shaping to come yet, but this is the basic construction of the neck. Mechanically, other than adding the fingerboard, there isn't anything else that we'll need to do to this other than some sanding and shaping.